Jamaica, Queens, 1972. A bank teller is staring at a note. She looks up. The man on the other side of the counter is calm, completely still, not nervous, not sweating, not looking over his shoulder at the door the way first-timers always do. He has done this before. She pushes the money across the counter. He takes it, walks out, gets in a car. Another bank, another city, another state, 60 times. 60 banks across multiple states, robbed by one man from South Jamaica, Queens. The federal government eventually sentenced him to 95 years in prison for what he built. 95 years. And then from inside that federal prison, he kept robbing banks. Not as a memory, not as a plan for when he got out. From inside the walls, while technically incarcerated. Using a college program that released him to attend the University of Michigan as a student, and using that freedom to hit banks while his professors thought he was studying. Then, from his prison cell, he instructed his crew on the outside on exactly how to rob the banks. He could not reach himself. The federal government could not contain him. The music industry could not ignore him. Jay-Z knew his name. Tupac knew his name. 50 Cent put his name in a song heard by millions of people and accused him of arranging the most famous shooting in hip-hop history. His name was Charles Williams. South Jamaica, Queens called him Slim. The world called him Chaz. And this is the story nobody has told properly. Charles Williams was born in Harlem, New York. His father was a World War II veteran. His mother stayed home to raise the family. When Chaz was 5 years old, the family moved to Jamaica, Queens, specifically to the 40 Projects in South Jamaica, one of the most unforgiving addresses in the borough. He grew up watching what segregation had done to his family when they visited the South, what the federal government's indifference had done to his neighborhood, and what the difference between the America on television and the America outside his window actually meant for a black child in the 40 Projects. He made a decision early. He was going to take what the country owed him. At 15 years old, Chaz Williams robbed his first bank. Not with elaborate planning, not with a crew he had spent months assembling, with the specific confidence of a teenager who looked at the most fortified financial institution in his neighborhood and saw not a wall, but an opening. He took the money. He walked out. And what happened next was not fear, not guilt, not the overwhelming sense of consequence that most first-timers describe when they talk about the moment after. It was clarity. He was good at this. The calmness that most people never develop, the ability to stand in front of a bank teller who could press an alarm button and end your freedom in 30 seconds, came to Chaz Williams naturally, like a musician who picks up an instrument for the first time and understands intuitively what it is capable of. He got caught shortly after, served time in a juvenile detention center. And then, rather than treating that detention as a warning, he treated it as a classroom. He planned a jailbreak. He created a distraction, used the commotion to slip out. He fled across the United States border into Canada, where he was almost immediately caught for another attempted robbery. The Canadians sent him to Montreal's prison de Bordeaux. He was 17 years old, serving time in a foreign country's prison, far from South Jamaica, Queens, far from everything he knew. He served his time. And when he came home at 17, he came back with a clearer understanding of exactly what he intended to do with his life. Not the small-time robberies of a teenager still figuring out the game. Federal banks. Specifically federal banks, because in Chaz Williams's mind, robbing a federal bank was not just a crime. It was a statement. It was taking back from the institution that had ignored Black Americans for generations. It was redistributing what the government had withheld. He built his operation methodically. A crew, a method. 1 minute per robbery, in and out before anyone could react. Multiple states to spread the federal jurisdiction thin. Through the 1960s and into the 70s, Chaz Williams built what the government would later describe as one of the most prolific bank robbery operations in American history. 60 banks, multiple states. Interstate bank robbery, which made it a federal crime rather than a state crime, meant the FBI was eventually involved. Not just local police. The full weight of federal law enforcement tracking one man from Jamaica, Queens, who had decided that banks were his particular area of expertise. He was eventually ranked the number 4 bank robber in American history. Not New York, not the Northeast, American history. That ranking sits in the same sentence as names like Willie Sutton, the Depression-era robber so famous that when asked why he robbed banks, he allegedly said, "Because that's where the money is," a line so perfect it passed into American folklore. Chaz Williams robbed more banks than Willie Sutton. In 1971, the federal government finally closed in. One of Chaz's crew members was arrested on an unrelated charge. Facing his own time, he made a calculation. He gave up names. Chaz Williams, the crew, the banks, everything. Williams was indicted and sent to a federal corrections institution in Milan, Michigan. Sentenced to 5 years. He was not finished. Less than a month into his sentence, Chaz Williams escaped. A violent shootout with authorities followed. He was caught again. This time, the consequences were heavier, and from inside that federal cell, he kept operating, not passively, not by sending vague instructions through intermediaries who might cooperate with investigators. He ran the operation. He told his crew exactly which banks to target, exactly how to approach the teller. The 1-minute method, the precise timed sequence he had developed across 60 robberies, was communicated from a prison cell to men on the outside who executed it and sent the money back for legal fees, because a man with Chaz Williams's criminal history generates significant legal costs. Lawyers who specialize in federal bank robbery cases, appeals, motions, the sustained expensive machinery of trying to fight a federal prosecution while sitting inside a federal facility. He funded his own defense through bank robberies directed from his cell. One of those crew members was caught. That crew member cooperated. The additional charges piled on top of what he was already facing. The federal government assembled everything. The original 60 banks across multiple states, the robberies organized from prison, the escape, the shootout, and handed down a sentence designed to communicate something final. 95 years. Let that number settle. 95 consecutive years in federal prison. For a man who was still relatively young, who had started at 15 and built something the government called one of the most prolific bank robbery operations in American history, that sentence was designed as a life sentence with the math shown. You will be dead before this ends. And then from inside the Federal Corrections Facility in Michigan came the detail that makes this story unlike any other in American criminal history. The prison system developed a program. Selected inmates, men serving long sentences who demonstrated academic potential, were given permission to attend local universities outside the facility. The theory was rehabilitation, education as a pathway back to legitimate society. Give men who might otherwise spend decades warehoused in federal cells access to the kind of opportunity that might actually change them. Chaz Williams was selected. He was released from federal custody to attend the University of Michigan, technically still a prisoner, physically free during class hours. He used that freedom the same way he had used every other opening the system had ever given him. He robbed banks. Not once, multiple times. Moving through Michigan with the same calm methodology, he had developed over 60 robberies, while his professors graded his papers and his corrections officers believed he was studying. When word of this reached the public, when people heard that a man serving time for 60 bank robberies had been given a work release program and used it to rob more banks, the reaction was disbelief. The federal government had released him to college as part of a rehabilitation initiative. He had used that initiative to continue the career they were trying to rehabilitate him out of. That is not a story. That is a system failing so completely that it becomes almost comedic. Except that it happened, documented, verified in his own words, in multiple interviews across multiple platforms. 2 bachelor's degrees, including one in business, earned inside federal prison while serving a sentence designed to end his life behind walls. Think about what that means. A man who had been sentenced to 95 years, who had escaped twice, who had robbed banks from inside a work release program, who had organized robberies by phone from his cell, decided that the way out was not through a wall or a window. It was through the law itself. He studied federal sentencing law with the same methodical patience he had applied to studying bank security, looking for every opening, every provision, every constitutional challenge that the system had left in its own structure. What he found, and what took years of sustained legal work to fully develop into arguments capable of winning, was that the federal sentencing framework of the era contained inconsistencies that skilled advocates could exploit. He was not a skilled advocate when he started. He became one. He filed his own appeals, not through court-appointed lawyers stretched thin across hundreds of cases, not through expensive private attorneys he could not afford while sitting in a federal cell, himself. Motion after motion, appeal after appeal, each one building on the last, each one demonstrating a deeper understanding of the legal framework surrounding his case. The federal government, which had assembled the evidence, prosecuted the case, obtained the 95-year sentence, now found itself arguing against a man who had taught himself federal law inside the prison they were paying to keep him in. He won. 95 years became 15 with 7 years of supervised parole. The federal government had sentenced him to die inside. He turned it into 15 years served and then walked out. That appeal, that sustained, self-taught legal campaign, is as extraordinary as any of the 60 bank robberies that preceded it. Maybe more so, because the robberies required physical courage and operational skill. The appeal required a completely different kind of intelligence, the patient, disciplined, methodical intelligence of a man who understood that systems built by human beings always have vulnerabilities that human beings can find. He walked out, and he decided he was done with banks. South Jamaica, Queens, the late 1980s and into the 90s. Chaz Williams comes home after 15 years. The neighborhood he returns to is not the neighborhood he left. The crack epidemic has transformed Jamaica, Queens, the way it transformed every black neighborhood in New York, simultaneously creating fortunes and destroying communities. The men who came up in that environment, who survived it, who built something in it, are now the names that carry weight on these streets. Kenneth Supreme McGriff, Gerald Prince Miller. The Supreme Team, the organization that had dominated South Jamaica's cocaine trade through the 1980s, that would eventually become so famous that 50 Cent would name them in a song and get shot 9 times for it. These are Chaz Williams' people, his neighborhood, his world. And from those same streets, a new art form has exploded into something global: hip-hop. Not the underground New York phenomenon it had been when Chaz first caught federal charges. Something that was now generating the kind of money and cultural influence that nobody from South Jamaica in the 1960s could have predicted. Chaz Williams looked at it and saw the same thing he had always seen when he looked at a bank: an opportunity. He founded Black Hand Entertainment, a music management and entertainment company built on the relationships he had developed across decades of operating in New York's underground economy. His name carried weight in ways that most legitimate businessmen's names never carry. The specific credibility that comes from a man who had built something real, survived consequences that would have destroyed most people, and come out the other side with his reputation intact. The music industry needed men who understood the streets. Artists who were building careers on the mythology of street authenticity needed managers who understood what authenticity actually meant. Not performed, not manufactured, real. Chaz Williams was as real as anyone in New York had ever been. His roster reflected the depth of his connections. Foxy Brown, the Brooklyn femc who became one of the most commercially successful and provocative artists of the late 1990s. Chaz was instrumental in shaping her early career, providing the kind of guidance and credibility that helped a young woman from Brooklyn navigate an industry full of men looking to exploit exactly the kind of talent she had. He was noted for keeping tabs on Jay-Z. The connection between Chaz Williams, South Jamaica, Queens, and Jay-Z, Marcy House's Brooklyn, ran through the specific geography of New York's hip-hop world in the 90s. Two boroughs, two men who had moved through the same underground economy from different sides, who understood each other in ways that people who hadn't lived that life never could. When Chaz died in 2019, the tribute post that circulated through New York hip-hop described it exactly. Kings of New York, Jay-Z x Chaz Slim Williams, Marcy Projects x South Jamaica Projects, two kings, two boroughs, one world. Tupac Shakur, whose own connections to New York's underground economy ran deep through his death row years, was another name in Chaz's orbit. Men who moved at the intersection of the streets and the music industry inevitably found each other, inevitably recognized what the other represented. He had ties to DMX, the Yonkers rapper whose whole identity was built on the kind of street authenticity that Chaz Williams embodied without effort. Ja Rule, another Queens figure whose career intersected with the exact same South Jamaica world that produced Chaz, the Supreme Team, and eventually the events of May 24, 2000. And then 50 Cent, a young man from the same neighborhood, the same South Jamaica streets, hungry in the way that men who grow up in the 40 projects are hungry, with the understanding that legitimate pathways are narrow and the underground economy is wide open, and the men who succeed in either need the same thing: the willingness to do whatever it takes. Chaz Williams managed 50 Cent in the early stages of his career, helped position him, used his connections to open doors that a young rapper from South Jamaica needed opened. And then something happened between them, something that Chaz Williams never fully explained publicly, and that 50 Cent expressed in the most public way possible. May 24, 2000. Curtis Jackson is shot 9 times in a parking lot in South Jamaica, Queens. He survives. He goes on to use the shooting as the foundation of the most successful marketing campaign in hip-hop history. And on Get Rich or Die Tryin', the debut album that would eventually sell 12 million copies, he records a song called Many Men. In that song, between the pain and the paranoia of a man who had survived 9 bullets and was still looking over his shoulder, he names a name: Slim. Slim switched sides on me. Let now Gaz ride on me. I thought we was cool. Why you want me to die, homie? One verse, 4 lines, heard by millions of people, pointing directly at Chaz Williams, accusing him in front of the largest audience any hip-hop record had ever reached, of switching sides, of being connected to the men who came to that parking lot with guns. Chaz Williams was named in a song as the man who may have helped arrange the most famous shooting in hip-hop history. He never publicly confirmed it. He never publicly denied it. He continued operating Black Hand Entertainment, continued moving through New York's music industry, continued keeping tabs on Jay-Z and Tupac Shakur, the two biggest names in hip-hop, through the connections he had built across decades of operating at the intersection of the streets and the music industry. The tribute posts that flooded social media when he died in 2019 described him as Kings of New York, Jay-Z x Chaz Slim Williams, Marcy Projects x South Jamaica Projects. Two boroughs, two kings, one world. And 50 Cent, when he heard that Chaz Williams had died, went to social media with a message that told you everything about the complicated legacy of this relationship. Why my name in this? I ain't got nothing to do with Chaz dead or alive. Here is the detail that separates Chaz Williams from every other street legend who became a music industry figure. He sued BET. He sued Netflix. He sued A&E. He sued Apple. He sued every other platform that distributed an episode of the American Gangster documentary series that told his story without his permission and without properly compensating him. Not through a lawyer hired on contingency, himself. The same man who had taught himself federal appeals law inside a prison cell, using those same skills to file a copyright infringement suit against some of the largest media companies in America. The motion to dismiss, filed by teams of lawyers representing billion-dollar corporations, was defeated. Chaz Williams won. A man who had started robbing banks at 12 years old, who had been sentenced to 95 years, who had kept robbing banks from inside prison, who had taught himself law and reduced his sentence to 15 years, who had walked out and built a music management company, who had been named in a 50 Cent song as a potential conspirator in the most famous shooting in hip-hop history. That man beat BET, Netflix, A&E, and Apple in federal court, representing himself. Chaz Williams died on July 13, 2019, in his own home in New York, not in a federal prison, not in a parking lot, not the way that most men who build the kind of life he built end up. 73 years after he was born, approximately, and 61 years after he robbed his first bank at 12 years old. The tributes that came from the world he had moved through told the story of a man who was more than the number. 60 banks, 95 years, 15 served. Those numbers are extraordinary, but the numbers do not capture what Chaz Williams actually was. He was a man from South Jamaica, Queens, who looked at every system he encountered, the banking system, the federal prison system, the music industry, and the legal system, and understood that systems are built by human beings and therefore have the same vulnerabilities that people have. He exploited every one of them. At 12 years old, the banking system. At 20-something, the federal prison system through the pilot program. Inside a cell, the legal system through self-taught appeals law. On the outside, the music industry through relationships built over decades. In federal court against billion-dollar corporations. The copyright system. Every system, every time. Chaz Slim Williams, number 4 bank robber in American history, music manager, legal strategist, Queens legend, the man Jay-Z called a king, the man 50 Cent named in a song, the man who taught himself to be a lawyer in federal prison and beat the sentence designed to end his life. Subscribe to Bloody Reports. Today we talked about interesting stories. Check our channel because we really care for your viewers. Thank you.